Hello, and welcome to my commentary on your Google Hangout 2 for Aaron, Todd, and Maria. Let me start by saying that I enjoyed your session. You had really good exploration of topics. Everybody took part in a discussion. I had a few comments on the Aaron, you had the camera on you all the time, so I got to see a lot of you. So try to make sure that for your third Hangout, you put in a full screen the person that's actually talking, because Todd had really long sequences that he was putting in, and some of them I was it's easier when you see the person talking. So try to manage the as a facilitator. For next time, try to manage to where I see the person talking. I think that was one of the very few things that I was thinking you can fix for the next time. And of course, you had some interesting noises coming from rubber toys and things like that. So I think I already told this to Kayla, but both your groups have huskies in them, so that was pretty cute. So let me start by addressing a few of the points that you raised in my commentary. Number one, you were supposed to discuss the Homeland Security and emergency management landscape of organizations or structures, or from the systems perspective. And it's interesting how different groups go about that. I think another group mentioned the things that Homeland Security typically does, like infrastructure protection, like disaster management, like intelligence gathering, like preventing terrorism. And so your group, and I think it was Todd, you looked at DOJ, ICE, Secret Service, Coast Guard, TSA, FEMA. It was really interesting. I don't know why you threw DOJ into DHS, because they are separate federal departments, but perhaps you were talking about who they collaborate with. So what I want you to think about when you think about the Homeland Security and emergency management landscape or enterprise, there's many different ways to conceptualize it. One is the way you went around it. So take the DHS as a federal agency and look at all the different agencies that it comprises. So, to mention, you mentioned TSA and Coast Guard and FEMA and Secret Service and ICE and so on. And then look at how it integrates with other federal departments, so the Department of Health and Human Services, Department of Justice, Department of State, Department of Treasury, and so on and so forth, Department of Transportation. So you can look at it this way, but also you can look at it jurisdictionally. So not just at the federal level, because we're used to think about, Homeland Security is so inherently tied to the DHS, but DHS is not all there is, right, in Homeland Security. So that's just federal level. Then you've got states, then you've got regions, then you've got cities and localities and counties and so on and so forth. So you can look at it jurisdictionally and take law enforcement, from federal to the local. You can look at intelligence services from the general federal to the local. You can look at education from the federal to the local. You can look, at all those different things in that scaled response. And then another platform that you didn't mention is public versus private. So when you start thinking about that system perspective, you've got a lot of different models interacting. You've got feds, then you've got that scalable thing going from the top to the local, and then you have the axis of private and public for all intents and purposes. There is a big divide between the two, the way they run business, the way they think, the way they lead, the way they are funded. So so that's, just to think about those three dimensions. And then, of course, there's also that you can think about, okay, preventing terrorism, one mission. Cybersecurity, another mission. Disasters, another mission. they are very, very different, right? In a lot of ways, it just cuts through a lot of ground. So that's that complexity that comes with Homeland Security, and with, A, defining it, and B, understanding a big picture. And I think Todd brought up that issue of a doctor and medicine as a science that, trains specialists to do foot surgery or to do the artery surgery. My brother is a angiologist. So what he does, he takes a vein from your leg and puts it in the heart, or whatever the angiologists do. But he has to understand the things about diabetes, and he has to understand infectious diseases, and he has to understand blood pressure, and he has to understand, possibly gynecology issues in a woman as well, because, some symptoms might not be necessarily indicative of just one problem. So our body is such a, magical, incredible thing. So that was a very good example of, the doctor that goes into the surgery, should they be able to, to do the mouth-to-mouth resuscitation? Should they be able to do or realize what those other components do? In order to be seeing it from the more systemic perspective. If you only know how to cut the foot, if you only understand how the muscles work in the body, if you don't know anything about neurons or, or teeth or and stuff like that, then you're not going to see this big picture, and you might miss that one point and the one piece. So I thought that was great that you pulled it out from the readings. Maria had a really good point too about doctors, that in a lot of ways medicine is a good example for protective and security services, because of the unpredictability of certain symptoms or certain issues that can occur with health, right, are unpredictable. Or you can open a patient and you just find something that no test showed, and then you've got to make those really, really quick decisions. So I thought that was really interesting. I really never thought about, responding to crisis and the surgeon responding to crisis. But certainly medicine is used a lot for emergency management comparisons, like, with preemie babies and nurses that have to diagnose symptoms of preemies that are totally different than regular babies being born, because they'll show them differently. So the ability to see the invisible or act on something that appears very suddenly is really important. So the second question about NASA, I think that Todd discussed about the issue about, not everybody knows everything. So in a model where all those different experts are brought into one room and they're forced to share and solve problems together, then certainly that's a much better solution. And Maria had her thoughts on the Washington, D.C. and the communications in those days. Certainly, there were such delays. Today we have a little bit different issue. Our technologies have certainly improved. So you had a good, the private aspect of NASA experience. I think that Todd pulled out the concept of joint cognition out of the readings, and I loved it that you brought the joint cognition, because it's this developing shared mental models is so critical in complex systems, and joint cognition is exactly that. So the perspective of an electrical engineer who is, who is an expert in this is not the same as somebody who's in marketing, or somebody who looks at it from maybe space exploration perspective. So you mentioned that you liked that comparison of the electrical engineer who tries to create a fused system, and move back and discuss the fusion centers and how they deal with stolen cars and July the 7th and your Dallas tragedy that involved your Dallas police officers, and how the state and local come to integrate at the Fusion Center. That's that interconnectedness of all those different partners, including DART. And to answer your question, Todd, we do have in Houston area, so for Harris County, for Houston, we have Metro Police. So Metro does very similar. Of course, we have much less transit, but you have in Dallas, but Metro does. So the line of Metro and Texas Medical Center, the bus hubs, the motorist assistance program. So that's the jurisdiction of the Metro Police Department, and they are a critical part at the Harris County Office of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. That's and subsequently also in the Fusion Center. And so again, I really like that you brought Fusion Centers to that, even though when we talk about issues and constraints and why we're not sharing information and why we're not communicating, Fusion Centers have come under huge scrutiny. And there have been questions raised about their effectiveness, particularly from in Texas, specifically from smaller departments that don't see the value of investment for the money. Because a lot of times in the Fusion Center, you will send, you've got to dedicate somebody. So you have to dedicate a full line of a job, so a salary from, let's say, small 20, 30 officer police department. And then oftentimes that officer in the Fusion Center gets a clearance for certain information that they are working with, and then when they get back to their parent agency, they can't share this information because it's classified, and not everybody or the rest of the officers there at the department doesn't have the need to know. So then the chief is thinking, I had that officer in the Fusion Center for a year, what did I get out of it? So Fusion Centers, they're great, they're very expensive for the local agencies to bear the burden of being part of them, and the funding has decreased for them because they're not necessarily predominantly focused on tourist activities. They have moved to all those areas you mentioned. They're doing a lot more for disasters than they do for tourism because they reflect the actual risk that we have, right? Their work. So great way to share information. Are they sustainable in the long run, and for who is a big question. So Maria again mentioned the communications and system communications with buds and with a program, and then you moved on to the issues with employee satisfaction, morale, recognition, and so on for the DHS. And some of the things that you've identified, certainly no respect, no care, no identification with employees. Employees in the field feel like scapegoats. The promotions based on nepotism and who you know and networking schemes rather than merit. All those things, you were probably really surprised that DHS had such low assessment of well-being of employees. But I think that you have to put it in perspective as well, because this is an agency that was created out of 22 different agencies, right? And then there were agencies that were created on the spot, like TSA. TSA did not exist until DHS was created, until after 9/11. And then you had agencies that were brought in, like FEMA, who had a departmental level authority, so they were linked directly to the president. Now they're under the Secretary of Homeland Security, right? So they lost a certain organizational, cultural aspect of their functioning. Then you have organizations such as Coast Guard that have very, very long tradition where they have really tremendous ethos. And if you took Coast Guard out of that FEMA, out of DHS, and did run separate assessment of their employee satisfaction, would be probably a lot higher overall, because that's one agency that has always had a very good organizational culture, and they did not lose it in a merger because they were not as molded into other things as some other agencies that got sort of reconceptualized. So when you think about, let's say FBI, FBI was created in 1908, so it's existed for over 110 years. This agency had a lot of time to create its image and brand and ethos and culture and support for employees, and being very, very monolithic, so very singular in identity. And then you have DHS, which gets created in 2001, in all the turmoil and also in this advent of technology and all those different other agencies and competing interests. And so it's hard for an agency like that to coin its identity and to have that ability to lead as well, because all those different groups came and had been merged and fused together, where some of them were competing before. In case in point, if you merge CIA with FBI or DEA with FBI, if you merge DEA with FBI, you would have one sick, toxic organization, because historically, FBI and DEA are two agencies that work very well together as separate agencies. There's a lot of pride in FBI that they're better than DEA, because, you know, if you couldn't make the cut to FBI, you became a DEA agent, and they are paramilitary, and we are the intellectuals. And then the DEA guys are saying, I could never be an FBI guy because, you know, or girl, because I'll be sitting behind a desk all day, and I really want to go in and kick doors more often, and so on and so forth. So those two different agencies, if they were put together as one, right? Because they're both under DOJ, but if they were put together as one agency, it would be probably really, really bad for morale of employees for a long time. CIA and FBI, you know, why there were failures in intelligence in 9/11, not because people don't want to communicate, not because people don't want to share information. We say all those things that are, you know, true, and they seem like truism, you know, we need to communicate, we need to share information. We all know that. What is it that prevents us from doing so? We do have constraints. And between FBI and CIA, those two agencies did not talk to one another since the time their two leaders, Bill Donovan and Edgar Hoover, were mortal enemies of one another, and they created distinct cultures that were so different for those two organizations, and each in its own right considers itself very elitist. So again, think about, I think you mentioned the mergers somewhere in your conversation. I believe you did. Maybe I'll get to that. But so think about the merging of those different organizations. So is it surprising that a report is like that? Well, DHS hasn't worked out its organizational culture yet, because it is such an amalgam of different agencies with, you know, different history, different ethos. So if you had to do the revolution, Todd was talking about how, you know, as far as promotion on merit, and how, you know, longevity in the organization doesn't mean that you have the ideas. So I think the point that you were driving home, Todd, was that you need to get your information for policy and for strategy from the boots on the ground, from people that are actually doing the work. And I think that's where DHS is failing, right? Obviously, DHS started as a federal level agency. It did not have anything at the ground level initially, right? So so it's a little bit different than with a police department, where, you know, you gotta have patrol officers before you have a chief of police. Well, you know, generally, or at least concurrently. So, and even in those policing organizations, people have experience of 20, 30 years, and they become chief executives, and then they have great ideas for policy and stuff, but they haven't been on the streets, and things change, and they change really quickly now with technology and stuff. So I think the point you were trying to make for leadership was to have a pulse of what you people are doing, to do the management by walking about, to come in and have those conversations with be ground level personnel, so you can figure out what their ideas are for solutions to issues that they see, instead of just coming up with policies. Or, I think you mentioned that somebody every now and then, around the times when statistics are needed for reports, I guess, pitch you for the Comstad. Comstad. And of course, you know what's going on, and you you think that it's just the pony and dog show, citing McChrystal, because they need it for their meetings, but it's not a true understanding of what you have and what you're dealing with. And certainly there has to be that reciprocity. All right. Common purpose team, you were linking your discussion to McChrystal as well, and then you moved on to the question on resilient organizations and resilience, as it links or doesn't to emotional intelligence. And you looked at those features, or 7 critical characteristics of highly resilient people, which was a présence d'esprit. If you wondered what that was, that is the spirit, the sort of the aura, the flow, the optimal flow, a good aura. So I call it a positive climate. That présence d'esprit, or when you go into the organization and you walk in, and I think you can do it, you can test it on any place on earth: doctor's office, school, grocery store, post office. You walk in, and the moment you walk in, you know what kind of place that is. You know if people like one another. You know if people are supportive of one another. You see it through the decor, through the way people work. Are they looking at you when you come in, and do they smile? Do they open the door for one another? Do they are they courteous when, or are they even looking at one another? Do they make you wait? Do they busy you with something else while you are waiting? I mean, all those things, pretty much within 5 minutes of walking into a place. I call it a climate. A place has a climate. It's either a bad climate or a good climate. It's made by people. It's part of organizational culture, and it's part of that presence of esprit is a good climate. It's there. When it's toxic, you know it. The esprit is gone. Decisive, tenacious. Tenacious is, they go for it. Honesty, self-control, optimism, and positive perspectives. And I think that you mentioned a very, very good point about that. All of those are learned. So all of those can be learned and can be nurtured and can be fostered, which is really good for the leaders. And you were talking about self-control and non-dogmatic thinking. I think it was Todd and Aaron, you had a sort of back and forth on that, but those are the ones that are overlapping. I mean, self-control certainly is one of the dimensions of emotional self-regulation, of emotional intelligence. And then some of them, like positive perspectives, optimism is really critical as well. And how does it link to emotional intelligence and systems thinking? So the bottom line is emotions matter, right? And optimism and self-control are really critical. You had a really good move on to managing your negative emotions. And I think Todd brought a really good perspective to this, how, yes, you do learn this with experience. You get when you're a brand new employee, you have very, very high motivation and you do all those things because you're very reactive. And then the self-control and adjustment and self-awareness and sort of diagnosing the issues comes into play. And then you realize that you can hold your horses on some of those situations. The example that you gave about taking the car away from somebody in sub freezing temperatures in the middle of the night, you're going to give it more thought now before you make that decision, because you get to control that urge to take quick action or go and reassess. And years ago, maybe, or under some of those conditions, people do lose control and they eventually lose their jobs. And I think Maria was mentioning, yes, you not only lose a job for yourself, but you're also affecting your family and others and stuff like that. And I see it every day. I see it every day where people get fired because they cannot control their anger, their frustration. They get provoked. The police officers get provoked all the time. Security officers get provoked all the time, and they use excessive force. They feel threatened. They overreact. It's that, I call it the stimulus, response, and gap. And a lot of times that emotional intelligence is about the gap. It's about not saying something because you react and then you are trying to get it out and you can't. It is there. It has been said. And you go and beat yourself up the rest of the day. Why did I do that? Why didn't I think? And that's emotional intelligence. The stimulus, and you want to flip a bird to somebody and they might turn out to be your new boss. So the stimulus, response, and we gotta allow ourselves gap. Todd had great things on people that insulted him, that throw up on him, that, all those really horrible things that can trigger you. And if you practice and develop that emotional intelligence, then you are able to be more in control. That's a very huge aspect of it. And that is very critical in crisis situations, to make decisions that are not crisis mode does not mean that you have to jump into the fire, right? There is always an assessment. There's always a size up. There's always necessity for the environmental scan and critical incidents. So I really liked those examples. Then you talked about translational leadership and complex adaptive system leadership. And Maria had a really good comparison for the translational leadership to be like, the liaison function of the middle person that's liaising, that connecting different various groups with various interests and trying to be that, I call it a linchpin for all different stakeholders. And certainly technology assists us with that, but you still need some kind of conduit, and it's usually going to be a person. You're going to have a really good reading next week on the Cincinnati case and the liaising component, and you can call it a translational leadership. That's what Jay did in that case, and you're going to be reading this. So Maria was talking about the future leaders, developing future leaders. There's definitely communications and cutting across different cultural breeds. And then you also had a conversation with how to make DHS more organic, is to see what other parts or realize what other parts are doing. And you're doing that in this program. You're trying to see what else is there in this whole Homeland Security, right? So you have a basic awareness how wide it is, that it's not just police, or it's not just local, or it's not just intelligence here domestically, but we are connected in so many different ways internationally, or comparative aspects of Homeland Security that you're taking with Dr. Morag about how other countries do that, all that is a really critical piece of understanding that, what's there that's common. And I think that's, mitigating risk. That's what it is. That's truly what Homeland Security and emergency management are about. It's about reducing risk, reducing exposure, increasing the physical and personal well-being, prosperity, and safety. So, but how different parts play what role in that. Todd had a really good example on a briefing before the operation, and how the gangs and the drugs and whatnot, whoever was going to be part of it, came and talked about what their part in that event was, and then the lieutenants talked, and then the commanders talked, and then once you had this big picture, then you can understand your role in it better. And I think that is really huge. I think this is where maybe you can think about that translational leadership is maybe what makes you still very Taylorian, to where you still have your checklist and you're going to have to do those things. But now you also opened up to translate to other people that have their jobs in the system. And in such a way, you are bridging that transformational or complex adaptive system leadership. So how to do DHS more organic? You talked about trust, and then you talked, and I think that, I'm not sure, maybe it was Todd that came up with the concept of all those different agencies that merged. And you discussed the merger and different cultures, 22 agencies, some of them being at odds historically. And it might require maturation processes for those agencies to sort of develop one common shared goal, because they're still having legacies, especially the ones that didn't exist. Especially the ones that existed in a different form, like border and ICE and stuff. They existed in a different form, and immigration, which was part of, INS, and that was part of the State Department and all this. So, and then the ones that are totally new. Okay, so the understanding who is doing what, and when you merge those different functions, there are constraints and there are issues that might take years to work out. So where does it lead us? Recruitment, emotions, getting rid of selfishness, and also the decision making in this one common area. You brought it back to, Maria, I think you brought it back to NASA. And I'll tell you something about, Aaron brought about the active shooter exercise, where you had the deans and VPs and leadership teams that participated in the exercise at limit for active shooter. And I have to tell you that this is, those type of initiatives are very difficult to pull off, because those risks are delayed. The consequences are far from today. They are really not on the radar of those policymakers at school. So bringing them together takes somebody who has to constantly liaise across those different groups. And Maria, you mentioned David Yebra and his setup for your exercise, and everybody was separate. And I agree with you. It wasn't good that they were all separate, but they were all there in one room, where before, 5 years earlier, you didn't have it at all. So it's very easy for us to look and say, hey, we need to share information. You've got to have everybody in one room. But all those people get paid differently. Some of them, by coming to this exercise, they have to be by law paid overtime for their agency. If their shift ended or something, they might have to be paid time and a half. Some of them, might be so busy that it's really difficult for them to take time away. They might have to find replacement for whatever project that they have. So bringing them all into one room is a feat already. And then if you want to have the continuity, you have to nurture it every single day. And I'll tell you something, David Yebra is no longer at the university, and we don't have an emergency preparedness director. So it's a lot of times those leadership things are about a certain personality as well. That's, and I think that he was in a lot of ways translational, because was able to bring, Butch Davis, who is the emergency management coordinator for Walker County, who is extremely tactical, with some VPs who are from the university, who are extremely intellectual people that don't typically mingle with the likes of Butch, to bring somebody from the hospital who is dealing with patients, so totally different environment, to bring somebody from marketing that they usually, don't really deal with those type of people in their meetings, right? So that's a feat in itself, and it's really difficult. So when we're talking about leadership and how it's built, recruitment of really good people, I think that perhaps we can leave it with this. Do you think that the Department of Homeland Security, and that's a question for you to think about, do you think the Department of Homeland Security has had in its 18 years or 17 years of existence an inspirational leader? And if you think that they did, who was that? If you can identify a leader in all those different directors or secretaries of Homeland Security, have you seen an inspirational leader among them? And if so, and now, if you don't, how would you put that job announcement? What would you want in that job announcement for the next Secretary of Homeland Security, if you don't think that the current one is doing a good job? All right. So thank you for your participation, and I'm looking forward to the third one. I hope you had a good break, and happy St. Patrick's Day tomorrow.